Have you ever been reading the Bible and come across something that just doesn't quite add up? Well, today, we're jumping headfirst into one of those puzzles. We're playing detective, looking at a fascinating case of mismatched quotes that has had scholars scratching their heads for centuries. And it all kicks off with one very strange passage. So, here's how we're going to crack this case. First, we'll lay out the mystery itself, this strange mismatched quote. Then we'll meet the two key texts at the center of the whole thing. After that, we'll dig into two completely different theories. One we'll call a divine edit, and the other the people's Bible. And finally, we'll see what this whole puzzle really tells us about Scripture.
All right, let's just get right to it. This whole thing boils down to a pretty provocative question. Did the writers of the New Testament, get their own scriptures wrong? Now, I know that sounds a little shocking, but once you see the evidence side by side, you'll see why people have been asking this for a long, long time.
Okay, so here it is. This is the heart of the mystery. In the Old Testament, in the book of Psalms, the original Hebrew text says, "My ears you have bored." Simple enough, but when the author of Hebrews in the New Testament quotes that exact same verse, it suddenly reads, "A body you have prepared for me." I mean, ears bored versus a body prepared, those aren't just slightly different words. They're totally different concepts. Yeah, this is definitely not a simple typo or a minor slip-up. Something much more interesting is going on. And to figure it out, we've got to go back in time and ask a really basic question. What version of the Bible were people actually reading when the New Testament was first written? And it turns out, our detective story really has two key players, two main suspects, if you will. And they're two different versions of the Old Testament that were floating around in the ancient world. So you have the original Hebrew scriptures, right? That's the source text. But the version that's absolutely crucial for our case is something called the Septuagint. It was the really popular Greek translation of the Old Testament. You can think of it as the international bestseller of its day, the version that most Greek-speaking Jews and early Christians would have known like the back of their hand.
So you can kind of picture the journey a quote takes. It starts out in the original Hebrew. Then at some point, it gets translated into Greek for the Septuagint to reach a wider audience. And then finally, hundreds of years later, a New Testament author quotes it. Our whole mystery is hiding in that middle step, the translation.
And this brings us right to the core of the debate. Was the author of Hebrews quoting directly from the original Hebrew, or were they quoting from that popular Greek translation? And if it was the Greek one, why was it so different to begin with? So let's explore the two main theories that try to answer this. Okay, our first explanation is a really fascinating one. It comes from an absolutely brilliant 17th century theologian, a guy named Dr. John Owen, and his solution to this problem was, pretty ingenious. So Owen's theory was basically this. The author of Hebrews wasn't actually quoting an existing text at all. He argued that the author, guided by divine inspiration, was revealing the deeper spiritual truth hidden in the original Hebrew. So in his mind, the new quote wasn't a mistake. It was an upgrade. It was a more perfect version of the text. And his logic was pretty straightforward. He basically said, look, why on earth would any sane translator change a simple word like ear into body? It just doesn't make logical sense. So Owen believed the change actually happened the other way around. The apostles' new, inspired wording was so profound and authoritative that later Christian scribes, out of respect, literally went back and corrected their copies of the Greek Old Testament to match what the New Testament said. It's kind of like a divine edit that traveled back in time. But, of course, there's another theory. This is the one held by most modern scholars, and it offers a much simpler explanation for what's going on. The modern view suggests that the author of Hebrews wasn't trying to be some sort of academic, carefully translating from the original Hebrew scrolls. Nope. Instead, they were being a practical communicator, trying to connect with their audience. And the evidence for this is really in the data. When the scholar Moses Stewart analyzed every single Old Testament quote in the book of Hebrews, he found a really clear pattern. Sure, some quotes match the Hebrew, but a whole bunch of them, what he called Class 4 quotes, are a perfect match for the Greek Septuagint, especially in the spots where the Greek is different from the original Hebrew. So what this tells us is that the author was just a really skilled communicator. They weren't pulling a quote from some dusty, inaccessible archive. They were using the version of the Bible their readers already knew, loved, and trusted, what you might call the people's Bible. The quote says, "A body you prepared for me," for one simple reason.
That's what the verse said in the Bible that everyone was reading at the time.
So we have these two theories. Where does that leave us? What does all this mean? The goal here isn't to declare a winner and a loser. It's to understand what this incredible puzzle tells us about the biblical text itself. When you take a step back, you realize this isn't a story about an error. It's a story about masterful communication. The author of Hebrews was strategic. They used the version of the text that would hit home and make the most sense to their audience. It shows us that the Bible's text has this living, breathing, dynamic history of translation. And honestly, far from weakening the text, understanding this context just makes you appreciate the incredible skill of the biblical authors even more.
And that leaves us with one last big thought to chew on. When we know that the history of the Bible isn't just a static, flat line, but this rich, complex, living story of transmission and translation and interpretation, how does that change the way we read it today? What does it really mean to engage with a text that is so profoundly alive?